What seems to happen is that the Russians first launch massive artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions, on Ukrainian defensive positions. These positions, once they have been softened up, to use this military expression, which I don't particularly like, by the way, softened up by heavy artillery barrages, these places are then overrun by Russian and Allied combined forces troops, principally infantry. There's then a advance, a rather rapid advance, until the next fortified line, when the process repeats itself. The tempo has been steadily intensifying ever since the capture of the important town of Popasnaya about 3 weeks ago, but that still remains the pattern of the fighting in Donbass. Now, when we did a program with Andrei Martyanov on the Duran some time ago, he explained part of the reason for this. It seems that the Donbass is a fairly densely, perhaps not densely populated, but densely built up area of Ukraine, that there are large numbers of towns and settlements and little in the way of open country, and that means that the Ukrainians are in a position to build up defenses in these towns and settlements, and there is relatively little maneuver space. There also seem to be quite a few rivers, the Seversky Donets River we've heard so much about, for example, and streams, and of course there's also wooded areas as well, which are difficult for advancing forces, particularly armoured forces, to cross. I would add that if one gets past Donbass, the area of Donbass, and there is some dispute as to how extensive the area of Donbass actually is, geography seems to suggest that conceptually it extends beyond the regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. It also, according to some geographical ideas, includes large areas of the Dnipro region, including the city that the Russians still call Dnipropetrovsk, but which the Ukrainians today call Dnipro. But once one gets past Donbass, one starts to move into much less densely inhabited country. Central Ukraine is said to be much more empty than the regions on the periphery, and perhaps, possibly, though I don't pretend to be very familiar with the local geography, but perhaps this area is more appropriate for deep tank advances. Now, I say that because, as I discussed in yesterday's program, the classic approach of Russian military to battle is that first you break the enemy's front lines, you encircle and destroy his troops, and then once you've penetrated the front lines, you engage in what are called deep operations. You send large armoured strike forces far into the enemy's rear, causing huge disruption to the enemy, causing breaking the enemy's supply lines, making it impossible for the enemy to reorganize and to rebuild, and in effect achieve victory. That was the approach, by the way, that the Soviet military followed in the Second World War, especially after its victory in 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, and of course it brought them all the way to Berlin. Whether it is applicable to modern war, and whether it is applicable to given the enormous changes of weapons, and whether there are enough tank forces anyway to conduct such operations, well, that of course is another matter which I'm not really in a position as a non-expert on these things to talk about. But anyway, that seems to be the position at the moment. We are moving from one Ukrainian military position to another, And in fact, the news that I got this morning, which is seems to be indisputable, is that most of the town of Liman, or perhaps all of the town of Liman, but I think it is probably more likely most of the town of Liman, is now under Russian control, and photographs have been released of the administrative building of Liman, that is to say the building of the local council, with the Russian flag, and, by the way, the Soviet victory flag, which seems to be widely used by the Russians and their allied forces as a symbol of victory. It was, of course, the red flag of victory during the Second World War, both flying over this particular building, showing that it has in fact been captured by the Russians. Now, I want to stress my sense is that the Russians do not yet control the entirety of Liman, but it does seem as if they certainly control its central areas and the greater part of it, and it seems plausible that most of this town will fall under their control fairly soon. Now, this is important because Liman is a town which is relevant both to the fighting in the north, in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, where this cauldron around the troops, the Ukrainian troops there, is now emerging, it's crystallizing, but it is also an important stopping point on the way to Slavyansk, Slavyansk being the northern city or town that makes up the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which is the last major concentration of Ukrainian troops in Donbass once the Lysychansk, Severodonetsk conurbation is cleared. Now, on the topic of the Severodonetsk Lysychansk conurbation, I said yesterday that the main road, the main supply road, has now been cut, and that does seem to be the case, but I also said that there are still country roads, other roads which could be used, and it's been explained to me that supplies can still get through on these other roads, and it's also been explained to me that in theory at least, the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk could still be withdrawn. The troops in Severodonetsk, said to number around 2,000, could be withdrawn to Lysychansk, which, as it is on higher ground, is arguably more defendable. But there is no evidence at the moment that anything like that is actually taking place. On the contrary, we still seem to see this pattern from Ukraine of stand and fight orders, which, as I've said on many occasions in these programs, appears to be both callous, at least to me, both callous and illogical. But it's the way Ukraine, or at least the political leadership in Ukraine, seems intent on fighting this war. And I have to say that it is starting to cause increasing disquiet within Ukraine itself. Now, I've spoken previously in earlier videos about rumors of dissension in Kiev between the Ukrainian military leadership, which does want more operational flexibility, which does want to allow troops to withdraw from undefendable positions, which apparently has repeatedly advised the political leadership to withdraw from undefendable places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. That advice, however, has been consistently overruled by the political leadership. But I've also said that there's now a whole slew of videos, of programs, of statements from Ukrainian military units bitterly complaining about how they've been treated as cannon fodder, in some cases complaining about how they've been deserted by their commanders, about how they've been sent into battle without sufficient preparation, how they don't receive artillery support or air support, how in some cases they've been sent into battle with machine guns against artillery and presumably tanks. And there's now a significant number of these videos which have appeared. I also spoke yesterday about a video which I had seen, or at least seen a part of, which suggested that one particular formation of the Donbass militia has also published a not entirely dissimilar video to the ones that the Ukrainians have been circulating, Ukrainian units have been circulating. Well, again, I'm going to take that partially back. I have received a flurry of reports from all sorts of directions from people who say that this particular video from this militia unit, this militia, Donetsk militia unit, is actually a fake, that it is a product of Ukraine's very sophisticated disinformation industry. I don't know actually that that is the case, but it's certainly true that Ukraine is very skilled, that the Ukrainians are very skilled at publishing this kind of misinformation. And for all I know, this video is another example. I just have to mention that. I want to stress, I don't know whether this is the case or not, but I received so many comments from so many people, including well-informed people, or people whom I believe are well-informed, that this is the case, that I'm going to partially withdraw my points about this particular video. And by the way, whilst I'm on this topic of Ukrainian disinformation, you will no doubt, all of you remember the events of about 10 days ago about that Russian attempt to cross the Zelensky Donetsk River and the drone footage that Ukraine released of all these blown up Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. I first said that this was clearly a Russian defeat, and then I pulled back and I said that it did seem as if some of these vehicles were Ukrainian, and Ukrainian footage might not have been completely reliable, or in fact at all reliable. And then I got more information from other sources saying that no, this actually is Russian material. These are real Russian tanks. These are real Russian infantry vehicles. And clearly there was a significant Russian setback there. Well, since then, others have looked at these pictures even more closely. They've identified some of the destroyed tanks as T-64s. The Russian army doesn't use T-64s. It uses T-72s and T-90s and T-80s, but not T-74s. So it does seem as if even that drone footage was not fully reliable, and at least some of the tanks that were shown in that footage were indeed Ukrainian after all. Now, I only mention that not in order to revisit that particular story, which it seems to me now is well in the past. It's just to provide more warning that information that comes from either side in this war, but perhaps particularly from the Ukrainian side, because they have a more sophisticated operation of this kind, information that comes is not always reliable and must be treated with care. And this video that I saw yesterday of this alleged militia unit of the Donetsk People's Republic complaining about the way they've been misused by their commanders, it seems possible was simply a case of Ukraine creating a video like this, perhaps to counteract the effect of all those other genuine videos of Ukrainian units complaining about the way they have been treated. Anyway, on top of that, we are now getting increasingly concerned and alarmed comments from top Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky says that Ukraine is now outnumbered in terms of heavy material by a factor of 20 to 1. Foreign Minister Kuleba has complained that NATO has done absolutely nothing to help Ukraine, and he's contrasted the failure of NATO to do anything for Ukraine with the European Union, which he says has done a great deal for Ukraine. I would say if Foreign Minister Kuleba thinks that, then why is he so keen? Why does he remain so keen to bring Ukraine into NATO? It seems an odd thing to say, if it's a rather an odd thing to wish for, if you really believe that NATO is such a complete broken reed or paper tiger, as Kuleba himself says. And there have been other Ukrainian officials. Arestovich says that until this vast number of Western weapon systems arrive, which will change the course of the war by the end of August, that Ukraine will suffer many multiples of defeat. I read in the Daily Telegraph yesterday an article clearly sourced from Ukrainian sources that Ukrainian troops in Donbass are outnumbered by the Russians 7-1. Now, by the way, about that I do not believe at all. I think that it's possible that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. I'm not even sure that that is actually the case. They're better organized. They are obviously much better supplied. I mean, whatever logistical problems the Russians allegedly had earlier in the war in and around Kiev clearly don't apply in the fighting in Donbass. They obviously have, as I said, far more material. They have total air superiority over Donbass. That is indisputable. But I don't know that the actual number of Russian and Allied troops on the ground significantly outnumber Ukrainians at all. Of course, if we're talking about Russian troops, they are contracted professionals, which may give them an advantage. They're presumably better trained. They're certainly better trained than some of these Ukrainian reservists that have been thrown into the battle. But as I said, in terms of absolute numbers, I'm far from convinced that the Russians actually do outnumber the Ukrainians to any great extent. And what reinforces this view is that another Ukrainian official, I forget which one, has come out and said that the Russians have assembled this terrifyingly powerful strike force around Izium, which is in fact the main concentration of Russian regular troops in this area of the northern Donbass. And that is true. And he's put the number of these troops at 20,000, these Russian troops at 20,000, which is, I think, highly plausible. And he says that this force is the most powerful force essentially in Donbass. This Ukrainian official is saying that, and it is about to be activated and go on the attack. Well, that seems entirely likely to me, but consider that if one accepts that, then this Ukrainian official is putting the most powerful strike force that the Russians have, at least in northern Donbass, they're giving to it a figure of 20,000 men, which is not far off the 12 to 15 or perhaps 20,000 Ukrainian troops, who are increasingly becoming bottled up in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk conurbation, and the perhaps similar or perhaps slightly greater number of Ukrainian troops who are concentrated in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. So it doesn't seem to me as if there's actually that much evidence that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in terms of personnel to any particular degree. They are winning in Donbass because of a combination of better logistics, better tactics, unified command, which appears to be working smoothly, unlike the Ukrainian command, which, as I said, seems to be racked with dissensions and which is being interfered with to a great degree by the political leadership. And also, of course, the Russian troops at least are professional troops, and presumably they know their business. So I just wanted to say that because my overall impression is that the Russians have never had numerical superiority in terms of personnel at any point in this war. Anyway, that's what the Ukrainians are saying about the development of the battle. Now, others are now coming forward and saying similar things. Now, there are reports, and these are, verified reports. This comes from the German media, that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, in a plane while flying to some meeting or other, had a briefing with German media, and apparently he told the German media that Ukraine cannot win, cannot achieve victory against Russia. The only question is where Putin, always they say Putin, when of course Westerners mean Russia, but anyway, the only question is when Putin decides that he's had enough and wants to stop. Well, that's an interesting comment, and one wonders what the German media, who are, by the way, solidly pro-Ukrainian, made of that. One wonders what the members of the German government, the Green ministers, Habeck and Baerbock, made of that. Presumably they want to escalate support for Ukraine even further, but anyway, that's presumably the information Scholz is getting from Germany's intelligence agency, the BND, and presumably he knows what he's talking about. And reading the British media, which has been extraordinarily gung-ho and supportive of Ukraine throughout the war, one again, as I said previously, as I was saying in my previous video, they too seem to be acknowledging that things are not going well for Ukraine in Donbass anymore. Now, of course, the Ukrainians are saying that they need more weapons, and coming back to an old discussion, the one I touched on yesterday, they are complaining bitterly that they're not getting the weapons they need to fight and defeat the Russians, that they are desperately short of equipment, that all the promises of Western weapons have not been fulfilled, and that they need these weapons urgently and now, because unless they get them, they will be defeated. Well, that's what the Ukrainians are saying. They don't seem to be talking as much as they were a few days ago about rebuilding their army in central and western Ukraine and re-equipping it with Western weapons and going on the offensive. It's difficult to avoid the feeling that at the moment the mood in Kiev has darkened. Having said that, there's one thing that the Ukrainians are still not prepared to do. I also discussed a few days ago how in the aftermath of the New York Times article calling for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, there have been a series of angry comments from Ukrainian officials saying that Ukraine will not conduct negotiations with Russia and still is committed to achieve victory, to driving the Russians out from all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. And the Ukrainians are taking this incredibly dogmatic position, even as reports are now circulating that more and more European countries, members of the EU, are also calling for negotiations. And we've had reports that Italy, Hungary and Cyprus are now saying insistently that negotiations must take place. They are apparently pushing back against an attempt by the hardliners, including EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, for a statement to be published at an EU Council meeting next week, setting out the EU's unstinting, unwavering support for Ukraine. Apparently, Italy especially is pushing hard for some kind of modification of this to include at least a request or a demand, if you prefer, for a ceasefire, something which at the moment the Ukrainians themselves are resisting, and which, if it appears in a statement, the Ukrainians will undoubtedly see as a sign of a weakening of position. Well, we don't know where all this is going, and we don't quite know how all this is going to pan out. But it does seem as if the situation is, the change of the situation on the battlefield is now causing dismay in Kiev and a change of mood in European capitals, which of course is combined with the darkening mood about the state of the Western economy. And it is so interesting to see that as the mood about the economy darkens in the West, as interest rates seem to be about to rise in the West, Russia is going in the opposite trajectory. Today, the Russian central bank cut interest rates. The interest rates were cut from 14% to 11%. They went up to 20% in the immediate aftermath of the decision to impose the sanctions on the Russian central bank. So they're now at 11% at the start of the crisis, at the time when President Putin announced Russia's special operation in Ukraine. Interest rates in Russia were at 10%. So they are back essentially to where they were before the conflict began, before the sanctions war was launched. And we have had a further report. There's been a discussion. There was a discussion, and one of those other many discussions about economic matters that have been held in Russia, in the Kremlin, with Putin chairing it. And over the course of it, Putin has said that it looks as if overall inflation in Russia might turn out significantly lower than expected. He's emphasized the fact that this is a tentative projection, but he said that instead of 18% or 20% or 22% inflation this year, as had been feared, the overall rate of inflation this year could be no higher than 15%. Now, given that the rise in prices in Russia up to now this year has been 11%, that demonstrates the fact that the actions that the Russian authorities have taken, and the central bank especially has taken, have not only brought inflation in Russia under control, but that we are actually now starting to see deflationary pressures start to appear. Food prices in particular seem to be heading downwards, and energy prices are doing the same. And it seems that the Russians have managed to cut deals with various countries to replace many of the goods, particularly the consumer goods, that used to be supplied from the European Union, but which are no longer being supplied anymore. There's been a deal of that nature apparently agreed with Turkey. And of course, Russian producers, as I said right at the beginning, have been able to turn things round very fast, much faster than people perhaps anticipated. So Russia seems to be seeing the output fall. That seems to be showing signs of bottoming out. Inflation is steadying. If we have had inflation up to now of 11%, and the expectation now is that inflation over the year as a whole will be just 15%, then that points to a fall, at least in some prices, over the course of the rest of the year. Meanwhile, Mr. Putin has bulging coffers. It's clear that tax revenues have held up. Unemployment has actually fallen. He's got tax revenues. He's got income receipts from oil and gas sales. He's got more money to spend, and he's spending it by increasing pensions. A step which obviously compensates pensioners for the rise in prices, but which will, by the way, also buy him a certain amount of goodwill, but which will also presumably sustain demand, which of course the Russian economy needs. By the way, the fact that Putin, who is a very, very conservative economic manager, has been able to authorize this increase in pensions must show that he has been given assurances by the finance ministry and above all by the central bank that inflation in Russia is under control, that they can afford to cut interest rates and to raise pensions at the moment because the inflation situation is now improving to the degree that it is. So we have an extraordinary turnaround. We have Russia cutting interest rates at the time when interest rates are increasing in the West, Russian inflation falling at a time when the West is in an inflation crisis, Russian shops bulging with food at a time when there are signs of scarcity and supply issues in the West, baby formula problem in the United States being just one example, the shortages of rapeseed and all that and sunflower oil in places like Britain, things of that kind. And of course, we are seeing signs of recovery in Russia's real economy at the very moment when the West is going into recession. I have to say that even I, who have tended to be an optimist on Russian economic matters, I mean, I would say not an optimist, but I would have said a realist, but even I have been surprised at the speed of the Russian turnaround. I've always said that the West doesn't understand the Russian economy very well, has little grasp of its scale and diversity. Even I have to say that the speed at which things have been turning round there, while obviously it's a tribute to the immense competence of Russia's economic managers, nonetheless, it is a sign that even I, apparently, underestimated the scale and resilience that Russia's economy has. Well, there we are. That's, it seems, where we are. We are seeing now clear signs that the situation in Donbass is moving towards a conclusion, and this now seems to have been understood in Western capitals. We see signs of growing dismay and alarm, and perhaps not quite panic yet, but the first indicators maybe of panic in Ukraine. And we also see that there is a darkening economic picture in the West at the very moment when the economic picture in Russia is brightening. I don't think many people expected us at this point in February to be at this point where we are today, and I wonder what the overall effect will be. We shall see whether the wise counsels of people like Henry Kissinger, I find myself gasping when I talk about wise counsels from the like of Henry Kissinger, but never mind, whether the wise counsels of people like Henry Kissinger are heeded. Anyway, that's enough from me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. Remember that you can watch us on other platforms, Rumble and Locals. And of course, if you're watching this video on Rumble, if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button there. If you press it, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join our Locals community and participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. We had a particularly outstanding live stream, by the way, yesterday, I should say. And you can also see the exclusive content that we publish there and which members of our community published there. And you can also find us on other platforms, the new free speech platform SuperU, the new other platforms like Odyssey. We're also on Telegram, and you can also support us if you want to support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course, don't forget to go to our shop, where you'll find all sorts of great things. As I've said many times, we made a point when we set up the shop to make sure that the quality of the merchandise that we sell there is exceptionally high.